I think that designers are basically walking storage facilities of visual stories, basically. So all the stuff that you're feeding your mind with, whether you go to the Tate or you go look in a design book or you go and visit a museum or a gallery and stuff, you don't know that it's going to be useful when you're doing it, but it is, and it comes back out, and your subconscious brings it back out.
It definitely draws a picture of what you're doing. And as a designer, you're taking all this, you're taking input from your everyday, and whether you're going out and seeking it, or you're just experiencing it, and you just put it like in a bank.
Which is a similar story with what happens with the cards, by the way, because I literally had a dream about it where things collide in your mind, visual ideas collide in your mind, and then they come out as a finished idea.
All right, so we got Asa Cook from Intertype Studio on the podcast today. Asa, thank you so much for joining us. I'd love to hear about who you are and what Intertype Studio does.
Well, thanks for having me. So Intertype Studio, we call ourselves a strategic brand design agency. Obviously, we've done a lot of entries into the Pentawards, so we have an emphasis on branded packaging. But really, we think about brands holistically. So we're often asked to work on things like wider touch points like comms or websites or environmental designs and the brand world of brands generally.
So how do you arrive at packaging and branding? What led you in that direction in the first place? What were you studying in school? What made you decide that packaging and branding was what you wanted to do?
Well, funnily enough, when I was at university, I studied graphic design, and I always used to end up doing projects where I made physical objects. I remember there was a guy that worked in the kind of print studio that helped you with the practical side of things, whether it was letterpress or screen printing and mock-up making. And I was always sitting in his room for hours making things. So if I was asked to design a piece of print, I'd end up making it into a game and it'd be in a physical box. I was obsessed with the kind of physical finish and appearance of things. And he said to me one day, "Oh, you're going to be a packaging designer." And I was like, no way. Because I thought I was, just a graphic designer, a conceptual designer. And I didn't really see myself as a packaging person. But then lo and behold, when I graduated, it was the packaging design agencies were the ones that were looking at my work because I had that kind of bias towards making things real, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's like I was in a similar position where it's just the craft of it. You're not in the computer. It's always a great process. So a big part of your design as I go through your website, intertypestudio.com, as I'm going through the site, what I get from your style, however many years from when you graduated, is there's a precision to the design. There's definitely a craft, whether it's in the print, in the type, in the form. There's just so many details to everything that you're creating. Like, how would you personally describe your style? Like, what is Asa's style? What are you known for? All right, let's take a quick second to talk about idpdirect.com. Go right to that website, download the design guides, the sustainability guides, the recyclable icon guide, which basically lists out all the different icons. It gives them to you in vectors. You can drop them right into your artwork right now, today, and go right into production. All right, back to the pod.
I mean, I always just believe in brilliant ideas which are beautifully executed. And the beautiful execution is just as important as the quality of the idea, but you can't have one without the other. To be honest, I don't really consider myself to have a style at all. I don't work in a particular aesthetic. So for instance, if you look at our website, you can see we've got something that's inspired by mid-century America. And then we've got other stuff that's inspired by Art Deco and other stuff that's inspired by China and the Forbidden City in China. So those aesthetics are entirely different. So I wouldn't consider, I was working on something today which is rooted in almost like cowboy culture in Texas and stuff like that, and a completely kind of new area, a new aesthetic for me. So I definitely don't consider us to have a visual style, but it's the philosophy and the approach that I think ties everything together. So we really believe in storytelling through design. I always say that, and I feel like I need to say, I don't mean that as a buzzword. I'm not just saying design is storytelling without actually meaning it or having any context to it. Because what I'm basically saying is that every detail, whether it's the finish, whether it's the typography, choice of material, physical shape, all of those things tell an individual part of a story. And maybe that's what you're picking up when you look at our work, is that all the details add up to a bigger thing. So the first thing that we do is we work out what the bigger thing is. And then everything that we do tells the story of that concept.
No, it does. does. And, I'm looking at Teahouse gin for the juniper and oolong, which is a beautiful bottle. You've got some amazing line work happening in the glass as well as the label. And then just below that on your website, you've got the teal scrubs edition, right? Which is this Art Deco playing card set. But I can still see the connection between those two from it's like this, there's a really preciseness to it. And it's just beautiful. And maybe it's just the colors that, because those two are so close together visually on the website, they feel similar. But I guess, I'm just looking, maybe as a designer, when you're looking through somebody's work, you start seeing pieces that start making a connection for you to tell you about this person's design style. So in terms of storytelling, how do you arrive? Like, let's take a look at Teahouse Gin. How did you arrive at this bottle shape? What are you telling the consumer when they encounter that bottle, when they hold it? Just the different details that go into that bottle, and how does it tell the Teahouse Gin story?
So there's massive depth in Teahouse Gin, and it's kind of a long story, but I'll try and tell it as briefly as I can. So I was lucky enough to visit China in October 2019. And this is where I met the client. But on the lead up to meeting the client, I was lucky enough to go to Beijing and go to the Forbidden City and go to the Great Wall of China. I didn't know at that point that I was about to get a Chinese brand and a Chinese client. But I was really kind of just immersing myself in the culture. So I was visiting like the Shanghai Museum, for instance, and looking at Qing Dynasty vases. And then I went to the Forbidden City and I saw a lot of amazing oil paintings. You go to certain rooms and there's amazing clocks that were donated from different countries around the world. I guess I didn't realize, but I was fermenting a lot of this information. And then when I suddenly got briefed on this Chinese project, all of those stories kind of came out. So with that project, we were asked to kind of build the concept of the brand from the ground up. And I came up, because I'd just been to the Forbidden City, I came up with this concept, and I'd heard about this Chinese empress that had basically opened up the gates of the Forbidden City to the wider world for the first time. And it's just hit me that this was an analogy for what this brand was trying to do, because they had these kind of international values, but they were also aiming very much at kind of traditional Chinese tea drinking and Chinese culture. And so there was this collision of cultures. So the story of the empress was the perfect metaphor for what the brand was doing. So that's why all of the elements of the design are inspired by stories of the Empress and of the Forbidden City. So I mentioned that I saw this exhibition of clocks, and I was really struck by the fact that all of these foreign governments and foreign visiting kind of dignitaries were visiting China and then going to see the Empress and taking these amazing gifts. And I was kind of really interested in the collision of cultures that was happening. So if you think of gin is from London, basically. It's a British spirit, but this is a Chinese gin. So you've got the collision of those two cultures. So we basically imagined a meeting between the Empress and a visiting dignitary, and then him giving the gift of gin and her giving him a gift in exchange, because there was this kind of tradition around the meeting of the two cultures. So, and we thought of a bird cage. So the whole structure of the bottle is inspired by a bird cage. That's why it's faceted with the vertical facet. So that, the liquid represents thing that came from England, and then the bottle that it comes in represents the cultural elements from China. So then when you look at every detail, you can see in all the detail that we've got this collision of kind of this London detailing and sensibility and typographic craft versus these Chinese traditional symbols and traditional Chinese shapes and characters and illustration style and that kind of thing. So to get to that point, we codified all those things. So we codified illustration, structure, textures, materials, typography, everything before we even did the design.
All right. So you said two things that I want to get into. One was, you mentioned that you spent time going through these exhibitions and you were fermenting information. I've never heard anybody say that they've been fermenting information.
I don't know if I've even said that sentence before, but that's just how it came to my head.
I love it, because it definitely draws a picture of what you're doing. And as a designer, you're taking input from your everyday, and whether you're going out and seeking it or you're just experiencing it, and you just put it like in a bank, right? And it's going to come back for something else.
That's exactly it. I think that designers are basically walking storage facilities of visual stories, basically. So all the stuff that you're feeding your mind with, whether you go to the Tate or you go look in a design book or you go and visit a museum or a gallery and stuff, you don't know that it's going to be useful when you're doing it, but it is, and it comes back out, and your subconscious brings it back out. Which is a similar story with what happens with the cards, by the way. It was completely designed by, or dreamed up, literally dreamt, because I literally had a dream about it, where things collide in your mind, visual ideas collide in your mind, and then they come out as a finished idea.
Yeah, well, that's just it. It's like, all these inputs and they mesh together. When they come out, it's going to be completely new, which I love. If finding your spec data is a wild goose chase around your office, you've got a data problem. SpecRite is the only cloud-based management specification solution that every brand needs. Because if you don't spec right, you'll spec wrong. The other thing you mentioned was that for Teahouse Gin, you codified the illustration. Mm-hmm. Explain to me, what does that mean?
What it means is that I went to Summer Palace, which is basically a huge garden in Beijing. And you see these pavilions. There's the most amazing painting and illustration on the ceilings and on the walls of these pavilions. And they were 200 years old or older. And I looked at them, and the colors were so vibrant and they looked so fresh. They looked like they'd been drawn they looked like they'd been painted like a week ago. And I had a hard time believing that they were 200 years old. What I mean is that we defined the whole concept of Teahouse Gin being these reinvention of these traditions. So with every code of the design, so color, for instance, color is directly, in all of those designs, is directly derived from photos that I took inside the Summer Palace, inside the pavilion. When you abstract those colors, because I was wondering, why does it look so modern? Why do those illustrations look like they were done yesterday? No, they weren't. And it's because the colors were so vibrant and modern, and the illustration was so simple and graphic and relevant now. It looked like it was very recent. So we were basically saying that the whole brand was about reinvention of tradition, because it's not traditional in China to make a gin. Tea is traditional. Yeah. So you've got that tradition and that modernity coming together in one thing. So every code of that design is about that collision. We broke down what that meant for illustration. So we took the images that I took inside the pavilion and then abstracted the colors and said, look how modern these colors are, and look how contemporary and vibrant this illustration could be, how modern and relevant it can be, even though it's based on a very traditional Chinese culture. That's what I mean about codifying. We broke down the reason why everything looks the way it looks.
And when you're doing that, what does that look like in terms of workflow? Do you have actual board for color and for type?
Yeah. So, I think that any brand is a combination of time, place, and attitude, or any one of those three things. So in other words, it has to be rooted in some time. The time could be now. It could be, like we were just saying, it could be Art Deco. It could be ancient China. It could be in Texas in 1950. Some of the stuff on our website is really inspired by the 50s. It's 150 years later than the Teahouse inspiration, but it's still a particular time. And with that time comes a particular aesthetic. So if you work out the time that a brand is rooted in, it gives you the aesthetic. Then you've got the place, and then you've got the attitude. So, you can be irreverent, or you can be fun and playful. So, you look at what we did on National Bohemian Distillery, and it's kind of fun and playful. So you layer that attitude into the time, which is the mid-century, and it starts to design itself if you understand what you're trying to do.
So a time period means then looking at the colors that were used during that time in a particular aesthetic.
Typography, illustration, colors, materials, everything. Yeah.
So Intertype. So Intertype is hardware, right? It's a piece of equipment from a particular era that had particular type. And there's that, tell me the story about how did that come about?
Exactly the same reason. Yeah. So trying to find an analogy for what we do, which is, we're trying to create kind of disruption or revolution in the way that design works. And that's what the Intertype machine did. So, everything, letterpress used to be, I've got a letterpress poster behind me here. Mm-hmm. Letterpress used to be wooden blocks that you picked out by hand. And, because I did this at university, so I'm sure a lot of designers do. You lock it into place, you find the components, you make this frame, and then you print it by hand. Then the Intertype machine came along. There was a competitor as well, the Linotype machine, which is the one that people have more commonly heard of. And it was basically like a huge typewriter. And when people wrote on the typewriter, so instead of a whole newspaper or a poster, instead of having to do it by hand, suddenly you typed on the machine, and then the blocks slid into place. They dropped down, and you could set huge, pages and pages and pages of copy and print it really quick. And it completely revolutionized the way that print worked and the way that design communication worked. And, we're trying to suggest that that's what we're doing now. But I think the whole idea of having an analogy for what you stand for and what you're going to do and what you aim to do is very much rooted in the way that we design, as you can hear, hopefully, when we talk about Teahouse or the playing cards.
Yeah. Well, I think I think that is the style, right? You say you don't have a style, but I think there's a style. I'm going to,
Well, it's an approach, right?
yeah.
It's a way of getting to a result. But what I like about it is that it's never going to get you to the same result twice.
Right. But it's it's extremely thought through, and there's a precision to that thinking. So it's almost this surgical precision for creating a brand and creating a pack, which is definitely not something you see a lot. You don't see that very often.
I always say to people that having a process is really useful, right? Because being creative is really hard, isn't it? You're trying to expect an idea to come to you, but if you have some sense of like what you think gets you to great design, there's no harm in having a kind of process, because as I said, what you'll get to is different every time. So I do sometimes say to people, trust the process and trust, working out who your audience is, what will appeal to them, what the story of your brand is, where it comes from, the time it's set. That's all just really useful, because anytime you're stuck, you can go back to that as a way to get to a great design.
Yeah, and so you do, so you also do not just packaging and branding, but you also do interiors and environments, right? So you've created some environments for Teahouse as well.
We didn't build them, but we provide inspiration for how they should look. So yeah, we're not people that go and manufacture that stuff.
Right.
We do that for a lot of brands. So we're working for a big beauty brand based out of the US recently, and they wanted us to design their point of sale displays. So again, with that, we're literally physically designing and sketching and showing the materials, textures, colors, where the logo goes, how the stuff's displayed, etc. And then when it comes to something like Teahouse time, what we're doing is expressing those brand values that I just talked about the collision of cultures, reinventing traditions, breaking down the colors and saying, okay, this is how color shows up in environmental design. This is how materials and textures show up, and basically just guiding the whole aesthetic of the whole brand. We don't physically make it, but we kind of codify it.
Yeah. So if we look back at your process, if you've got 4 main steps in this process, like what are they? What's your first, second, third, and fourth?
So I would say the first thing is the story of the brand and how that breaks down into the time, place, and attitude of the brand, and then what falls out of that. Then you break that down into specific ingredients. So color, typography, iconography, illustration, photography, textured materials, form, physical shape. You can work on all of those things. You think about all of those things, because all of those things need to be there for a reason. So I'm making it sound a little bit too process driven, I think. And it's not a scientific. It's not as scientific as that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is the kind of aim, because if you don't do the thinking, you need to do the thinking basically, as well as just the doing.
Yeah. Because
if you don't do thinking, nothing, it just won't be very valuable or useful. So all the great design agencies that I admire, you can feel that depth has gone into everything that they do. I really don't like design that's just surface, that's just aesthetic, that's not actually building anything that's relevant when it comes to what the brand stands for or what the product is. So I think you have to go through that rigor, but otherwise what you're doing doesn't really have much meaning.
There's no longevity, right? There's no longevity.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And there's no reason to believe in it, right?
Yeah. And if I look at I'm looking at the Teahouse, I'm looking at the Natty Bow. Did you guys come up with Natty Bow, or is that what it's referred as?
Natty Bow is so they've made beer for a long time, and all the locals it's called National Bohemian, but all the locals call it Natty Bow. And so the little character, his name is but we kind of reinterpreted that as being like natty in English means kind of smart or dashing, or which I don't think is why he was called that. But we kind of used that as a way to kind of dress him up and make him really kind of almost ironically sophisticated, and he's this super premium kind of like concierge server type, butler type character.
Yeah. So if I look at like Teahouse, if I look at the Natty Bow or the cards, it's funny, but maybe it's not funny. But I think there's a sensuality there in terms of packaging, and and maybe it's just the way that I view packaging, where it's packaging is really, it's personal. You're interacting with it. There's a sensuality there. When I look at the Teahouse, there's definitely a sense of that there. I guess, how do you instill an emotion into packaging? Everybody's concerned about sustainability today. What if I told you can take your pouches, labels, your single serve wrappers, and make them completely dissolve, make them completely disappear in water? That's what the team at SmartSolve has done. They've got a paper that is certified flushable. You can actually take the packaging, put it in the sink, put it in the shower, put it in the toilet, flush it. It dissolves completely into fibers. Learn more about SmartSolve. Go to smartsolve.com and ask for samples. Now, let's get back to the show.
Well, I think the amazing thing about packaging is I think it's the hardest thing to design in the world, by the way, because it requires so much, technical knowledge, so much skill in typography, illustration, 3D design, like every type of skill is needed for it. But what I love about it is that it's engaging all of the senses. So unlike digital design, which can use like sound and vision, with packaging design, you've got sound because the sound it makes when you open it or whatever. You've got the way it looks, but you've also got the tactility of it. So it sort of engages, and even the scent of it. So it engages all of the 5 senses. So I'd say I'm really quite fascinated by the contrast in different materials, always juxtaposing gloss finishes with really matte finishes, or embossed with smooth, and I think that really great packaging designers always consider that sensory experience. I think what you're describing is like the sensory experience of a physical thing, and I think it is really crucial as well.
It's awesome. And then so last year you took home 4 Pen Awards, which are wonderfully displayed behind you there, including Newcomer Award for the studio. So how does winning an award like a Pen Awards, how does that help a growing studio?
I mean, that's kind of a hard question to answer. I think that what it's done for us is really reassure our clients, because I think, they'd already come to us, or already working with us, and obviously must have liked us. But I think it's a little bit of like, and a lot of them were like, looking at the work that we're doing and going, really loving it, really loving what we're doing. And I think it just kind of like helps to confirm that in people's minds. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like, because it's judged by really, well-known people, really good high-level creative directors, people that are very creatively involved in brands at a very high level, and they're your peers and they're saying, we think this works great. It really helps, I think, to confirm that in everybody's mind. So we were really thrilled, to get that honor. And it's been great to be able to display it on our website. It's on our email signature. Best newcomer agency, added it to everything to kind of keep reinforcing that, it's not just us that think we're good.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just best newcomer in London, right? It's best newcomer just as an agency in this industry, which is amazing.
Yeah,
and
we were really thrilled with it. Very pleased.
That's awesome. And you're a newcomer because you've been in business you started about 2 years ago?
2 years, yeah.
Okay. So, you were with an agency previously for like 18 years, and you left to start an agency 2 years ago, which is 2020. You crack open the doors of this new agency, and then the pandemic hits, right? Yeah. So what happens? Like, what goes through your mind?
Well, first of all, I mean, I guess it was unlucky, but it was also lucky because we were in conversation about a studio space, which, was in the middle of Soho in London. And we were working out of that space, but we hadn't signed a lease yet, so we hadn't committed to that. So obviously we had to start working like from home like everybody else did. But actually, versus massive established agencies who have these massive empty spaces and these big overheads, we were lucky because we were almost kind of formed during that time. So all of our ways of working, we didn't have to adapt. Like, we didn't have to stop doing something a certain way. We built our ways of working based on remote working. So in some ways, it felt like a kind of benefit, very scary, obviously, when at first, because you're like, well, where's the work coming from? And like, are we going to get any work? And, we had some quiet times at the beginning which were a little bit scary, and which is why we did the playing card project, because that was a self-initiated project. But yeah, it was obviously a massive step to take and challenging times to do it. But I think often in times of adversity and economic downturn and recession and stuff like that, a lot of new agencies are often born in those situations, and it creates a lot of opportunity, I think, because it like levels the playing field, especially in this situation, when if I was sitting in my living room talking to a global brand director, they didn't find that weird. Right. Whereas if I'd been doing that before the pandemic, they would. So it kind of made it, I think people more than ever realize that when you buy into an agency, you're just buying into people, right? So it's people, their skill, their talent, and that's it.
Yeah.
And that's all you need.
It's not the beautiful office behind you in your Zoom call.
You don't need a massive reception and with beautiful coffee tables and design books and flowers and stuff everywhere. Really, you just need great designers. And I think the pandemic brought that into sharper focus, I think.
That's awesome, man. So how do you land that first client?
I mean, I would advise that if people are going to start an agency, that they have an idea of who their clients are going to be before it gets to that point. So obviously, I was able to do that, to find new clients very early on. And then beyond that, I mean, a lot of people have said to me, like, where is the work coming from? Because I used to ask people that started up agencies that question a lot, like, how do you get the work? And I just sort of didn't know where it comes from. But I think it's your whole portfolio, it's your whole history, right? It's your whole working career comes back to you. And when you start an agency, it's amazing the number of people that contacted me through LinkedIn, who I'd used to work with a long time in the past.
Right.
And going back like a decade, and people getting back in touch. And they want to support. And I wondered if that was another benefit of the pandemic as well, is people wanted to support a new business and a small business. And maybe people thought, wow, this is a hard time to do it. So let's get involved. I don't know if that was a benefit or not, but a lot of people got in touch, and really most of the work kind of has come to us, to be honest.
That's amazing. And the work that you guys are doing is so much fun. So are you working on anything currently that you're really excited about? You mentioned a cowboy thing. We can't get too into it, but
I'm working on loads of things. There's a Texas thing that we're working on, which I love. There's a massive global brand, super premium brand that we're working on, which is an amazing client, and we're doing brilliant work for. I can't wait to share that, because I think, being best newcomer and working on small projects like the gin or the playing cards is one thing, but when you start to work on like globally known brands, we can't wait to share that, because it's it's the next step.
Yeah,
basically.
That's awesome, man. And you found yourself using any like QR codes or augmented reality or any of those items that can seem kind of gimmicky, but I think people are starting to use now because of the just pandemic?
I'd say that it's come up quite a lot in brand world conversations, what we can do with that kind of stuff. I mean, we in-house, we don't have the kind of skill set to do VR or that kind of stuff. But in the same way that I mentioned that, like when you build a brand and it's got a story behind it, and that story applies to everything from the identity, the typography, the colors, the layout, the environmental design, it also applies to everything else. So, with Teahouse time, for instance, we created these porcelain dogs, because the Empress always had her favorite animal was a dog. She had pets, these pet dogs around her all the time. So we were thinking about social media in the way that people want to share things, and what would get people using WeChat in China would be the opportunities to photograph these physical real things, and then they would then go into the digital space. So we are constantly thinking about the way that physical design becomes digital design and the crossover between the two, but we don't necessarily create apps or that kind of stuff ourselves, but we'll suggest ways people that brands can partner with to do that.
Have you ever wondered, how do I reduce my carbon footprint? Should I focus on recycled content or reducing weight first? Which design strategies are the most effective for my products? Triac offers multiple solutions for lifecycle assessment, goals management, reporting, EPR fees, and more. Visit triac.com to connect with our team and register for a free 10-day trial of Eco Impact Compass to get started today.
Yeah, that's always great to have that conversation with the brand. And as you're designing packaging, because you're taking so many inputs from everywhere else, you see an opportunity. Maybe it's in an area that you're not proficient in, but just to be able to throw that idea out to the brand and then let them run with it and create something amazing.
Literally just before this meeting, this podcast, I was in a meeting with a client where we were talking about their website, and they wanted our guidance on their website. I mean, we don't host and build websites, because especially not e-commerce one, because they require a lot of maintenance. You need to it's a specific skill set. You need a front-end developer, back-end developer, and what we can do is make that easy for a client, because if you've got the identity and the visuals and the photography and the look and feel of the whole brand, and you've got guidance on how your website should work and how it should look, that's the hard part. The hard part of any digital design is the content, and then if they can take that palette and then they can go and work with a technical expert, then they've got something great, like fast, So we've done it recently for something that I can talk about it now because it's just come out, but there's a sugar brand in the UK called Bonraw, and we've designed their pack and their whole brand and their whole brand identity and their whole brand world. But they've got a really big e-commerce website which is hosted and run for them by somebody else. But we provided all of the digital assets, all the typography, all the photography, everything, all the iconography, all the assets that they needed to create it, basically. So then the other company just inputs all that. And makes it functional.
You've got a bunch of drinks packaging. You've got some cards. You've done some, interior. You talked about web a little bit, not that you're designing it, but that you're providing concept for it. And now a sugar company, and then some Texas cowboy thing that's happening. What's like the perfect Intertype Studio client? Like, who are you looking for and who should be reaching out to you?
I think anybody who wants to put a depth of meaning and quality and storytelling into their brand. So people have said to us, a lot of what you do feels premium. I mean, the sugar product that we're working on, yeah, it's premium. It's a great quality product, but it's not a massively expensive purchase like the gin bottle is. So people sometimes say to me, "Oh, do you only do super premium stuff?" I'm like, no, we just do good stuff. So what we're looking for is quite broad, really. I mean, I do love working on drinks design and really premium spirits brand, because you've got all that opportunity to do all that tactile, sensorial stuff that we talked about, and there tends to be quite a lot of investment in design. So that's why working on that stuff is so great. But equally, you can work on things that are more accessible and more approachable and more mass and less high cost of good, but it's still, the design can be amazing still. I mean, the playing cards is a great example of that, because it's just a box, right, with some cards in it, but it looks really super premium just because of the way it's executed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I like that idea in terms of, it's not a generic product, but it's just a standard product, right? Just a commodity product. So a sugar, for example, is a commodity.
Yeah.
But the design can elevate that to be something that, somebody may want to just keep on their counter,
definitely.
Yeah, you don't have
you can make anything. You can make anything desirable through design. I think Aesop's a really good example of that, for instance. Like, so ultimately, and soap is a commodity, really, technically, isn't it? But the design elevates, so you can elevate anything. And I've always had this philosophy that any design project can win an award. And you can make anything amazing. And so as soon as you start kind of thinking, well, oh, that's from this category, or that's this, that's not going to be as good as other design, then you kind of already lost, right? So we don't want to have too much of a narrow focus. We just want to do great design, basically.
That's awesome, man. So Asa, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate you being on here. You've got amazing work. Congratulations on winning Best Newcomer. I look forward to seeing what you're going to win this year. Hopefully hopefully there's some cowboys in it.
Fingers crossed. You never know.
Absolutely, man. So if anybody wants to reach out to you, what's the best place for them to find you?
Well, if you go on to intertypestudio.com and scroll to the bottom of every page, it's got it's actually got my phone number on. So people just randomly ring me up sometimes. Go, oh, I've got this brand. I'm in the US. I've got this brand. They get straight through to me. So yeah, email or send a WhatsApp or whatever.
Perfect. Amazing. I'll have all the links in the show notes. Asa, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We'll talk soon.